And a big welcome to everyone who has joined us today. This is webinar number 5 of the Pacific Resilience Partnership webinar series. The specific focus for today is on internal displacement, and it is being done in partnership with the Pacific Resilience Partnership Technical Working Group on Human Mobility. Your moderators for today are Alisi Fosa-Levu, the Pacific Regional Advisor for the Platform on Disaster Displacement, and Nathaniela Mbolo, Project Manager for the Pacific Response to Disaster Displacement, part of the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. And with that, a big welcome, and I hand over to Alisi and Natha. Thank you.
Bulavinaka everyone, and welcome to our 5th webinar series. I would be your moderator for today. So on behalf of IOM and GIZ as co-chairs of the Thematic Working Group on Human Mobility, I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar. We are extremely excited to have the opportunity to come together at this 5th webinar under the Pacific Resilience Partnership to talk about an issue that is extremely critical to our region. Before moving on, I would like to now give the floor to Tia for any initial points. Tia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Just, I guess, the logistics, if everyone can please mute their mics and turn off their video. Only the panelists will be having their videos on, and will unmute when it's time for their intervention. Thank you, Alisi.
Thank you, Tia. Now we will start with our webinar for today. So basically our webinar is focused on stories of resilience, recovery, and solutions in the context of internal displacement. Most of you may know that we already have an established technical working group on human mobility, and we have been working with the high-level panel on internal displacement. They have been established by the UN Secretary General to put together a Pacific regional consultation. So with our small group working on preparing for this consultation, we came to the consensus that before we make any recommendations and best practices on how we address displacement to the high-level panel, there was a need to get a sense of the context of internal displacement in the Pacific region. And we know most of our countries, we each have our own experiences with how we address internal displacement in our own countries. And so basically we propose to have this webinar, and just to basically get a collective understanding of experiences and perspectives relating to the issue. And that's why we brought everyone together who are experts in their own fields. And we feel that sharing your experiences and the perspectives on these issues would be more valuable and more informed in terms of the input that we would be putting across to the high-level panel. So basically the importance of these human stories of resilience, recovery, and solutions in the context of internal displacement cannot be stressed more. We acknowledged the need to move beyond trends and statistics, and instead to understand basically how this affects individuals and communities' lives and livelihoods and beyond. So basically with this in mind, we have a lineup of 3 speakers today, and we thank them for, we have 4 speakers today, and we thank them for accepting our invitation to be on the panel today. and where we will kickstart our discussions with stories based on their work and their research across the Pacific region. After the four speakers, we will then show a short video providing us with a tangible example of internal displacement and planned relocation. Following this, we hope to open the floor to you, our participants, in the spirit of Talanoa, to basically learn from your experience and stories in living, working, and addressing displacement contexts. Following this, we hope to wrap up our discussions by sharing some of the upcoming regional and global platforms where we can summarize this work. Today's discussion is a start of a series of webinars on this important topic. So if you would like to share your story at our next session, please don't hesitate to reach out to Tia at the PRP support team or Sabira from the TWG. We really need your stories. They are all important, and we hope that we will be hearing from you. Apologies if we don't have time to speak at this webinar series, but like I mentioned before, this is a series of webinars that we will basically reach out and try to get as many stories as we can in terms of addressing displacement at your own areas of responsibility. So before we begin, just some housekeeping rules. I know that everyone is familiar with, considering that we have had many virtual sessions. First one, kindly request that you all have your microphones on mute if you are not speaking. And also we request to raise hand in case you wish to comment or raise a question, or to unmute and take the floor. And we have the chat box there that we can utilize to send messages, as well as links to materials that we can access. So with that, I now pass the mic to Natha. Vinaka Natha.
Vinaka Alisimbula Vinaka, ladies and gentlemen. Without taking further ado, it gives me great pleasure to now introduce our first speaker for this Talanoa session. As Alicia have already alluded to, and the intention of this session today. Dr. Temi Tebi is an assistant lecturer at USP. She will be sharing her story today from her perspective as a Solomon Islander, and the story of her own people in terms of being displaced in the Solomon Islands. With that, I give the floor now to Temi Tabe. Dr. Temi Tabe.
All right, thank you, Natha, and thank you to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to share my story. Basically, I wanted to share something that I've been working on as part of my study and also as part of my job here at USB. So I'm just going to share some insights and hopefully pose some questions that we can reflect on during the discussion. So in my study of the Gilbertese relocation to the Solomon Islands during the colonial period, it was understood based on colonial records that it was a humanitarian intervention by a concerned British colonial administration. So the relocation was for the good of the Gilbertese people and to provide them an opportunity to improve their standard of living, but also to escape the prolonged periods of drought in the Phoenix Islands. Yet those who planned and administered the relocation failed to understand that moving a large population beyond their cultural and natural boundaries was not embraced by the people as a humanitarian assistance, but rather they felt and saw it as being uprooted from their land to a foreign country, now a home to them and their descendants. So to be uprooted from their land tells more than just a movement of a group of people from one island to another and from one territory to another. It underlines an important fact that Pacific people are deeply rooted in their land. The land, the sea, and everything that surrounds them, both living and non-living, defines who they are as a people. So when they were uprooted from their land, there is an unthinkable sense of loss and injustice to their survival, not only as a family, but as a community and as Gilbertese people. So the process of being uprooted, as they describe, illustrates the removal from their land, which grounds them as a people and therefore leads to displacement. So while displacement of communities and people have occurred across the Pacific, most of the documented are related to extreme climate events, and more recently, a few cases on climate change impacts. However, there is no clear distinction about displacement when we talk about extreme sudden onset events, such as tropical cyclones and slower onset events like sea level rise. Displacement has been defined as situations where people are forced to leave their homes or place of residence, often in the form of flight or evacuation. While the framing of these movements have been conceptually defined, what does internal displacement mean, and who does it refer to in the context of the Pacific Islands and its people? Is it defined based on geographical and spatial nature of the movement within states' territories or communities' land boundaries, or is it based on the process involved in the movement? Are these types of movements understood by Pacific Islanders as internal displacement, or what does it mean for them? If the people are deeply rooted in their land and connected to the environment and ecosystems, doesn't the degradation, depletion, and absence of these elements already create a sense of displacement among the people? What does displacement mean for Pacific Islands people and communities affected by climate-related disasters and are forced to evacuate their homes? Or what does it mean for those who have been relocated or may be subject to relocation as a result of climate change? I often find the defining of this movement problematic, especially in the context of the Pacific Islands, because they limit us to only defining and categorizing the way people move without actually examining and understanding the strengths and dynamics of these movements that have been culturally embedded and observed by the Pacific people for many years. If internal displacement is the forced movement of people within the country they live, we are already categorizing and framing this movement based on place, boundaries, and space. While this is relevant to inform decisions governing interventions in the development and implementation of migration and displacement policies, it shifts our focus from understanding that Pacific Islanders have always been culturally mobile and are resilient people. They thrive on social relations and networks, and while they are grounded in one place, they can also be from many different places. So how can these characteristics and strength be used to build and strengthen existing migration capacities and pathways, and how to strengthen social networks or inspire and construct new routes of movements? The Gilbertese have lived in the Solomon Islands for almost 60 years. They have become integrated into the larger Melanesian society, but they remain a minority community. In 2007, a tsunami that struck the Western Solomons displaced many of the Gilbertese residing at Titiana. Most of them did not understand and were not prepared for the tsunami. While many of them fled to the hills, some were caught in the waves and lost their lives. Families were displaced in the hills, and most of them feared to return to the village by the coast due to the disaster. However, studies conducted subsequent to the tsunami revealed that the Gilbertese people were the ones mostly affected by the tsunami because they lacked the cultural understanding of the disaster, the environmental setting, and preparation and evacuation measures to undertake during the warning. While many have rebuilt their homes and lives, can we say that they have become resilient? When we talk about the resilience of the Gilbertese people, first, they were being displaced from their homeland in the Phoenix Islands to the Solomon Islands, and then internally as a result of the tsunami. How is resilience being framed in their context? So how can we frame resilience in the context? What are the different elements that constitute resilience? How is resilience defined and measured by the Gilbertese people, or in this case, the Pacific Islands and its people? Are relocated and displaced communities considered resilient if they successfully reestablish themselves in their new homes? Perhaps it is important to consider what defines and makes a community thrive despite being affected by climate change or related disasters. Maybe by understanding these core elements and structures that enable the continuity of a community despite being affected or being relocated and displaced, then we can better understand and inform the types of interventions, solutions, and policies that can be developed and implemented to protect and to ensure the continuity and the resilience of the community in the new destination. Displacement is never an easy topic to be discussed, nor is resilience, especially when one is being uprooted from the basis of what defines them as a people, and especially in the context of Pacific Islanders. But sometimes the hardest things to talk about are the very things that inspire change, hope, and resilience. So with that, I'll just end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tabe, for that insightful story and sharing the experience of the Gilbertese people in the Solomon Islands and giving that historical background and how they were affected in the 2007 tsunami, and for raising the questions as well about the definition. Now that we have a global definition of internal displacement, does that reflect our context? And that exactly is the point that is coming across from your story. And then the other question that you probe as well about how do you define or frame resilience within the context of the internally displaced people in this situation, the Gilbertese. So thank you so much for that. We will take, just for everyone's information, we will take questions after all the presenters have made their sort of opening remarks. And then we'll have our Talanoa session. But I've just been notified that the video that we mentioned earlier, we won't be able to screen it now because of technical issues, but also due to time, as we wanted to have to give time for the presenters to present, but also enough time for interventions and Talanoa to happen today. So our next speaker is Mr. Mark Stage. Mark is the executive councilman from the Malolap Atoll local government. So he'll be sharing his experience from the local government perspective. So we have a very good range of perspective and stories in this conversation. So I will hand it over to Mark to share his story. And should you have any question, please don't hesitate to keep popping your questions on the chat room, so that we can address it later on. Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Vinaka. Yahweh from the Marshall Islands. I have a slide that, a couple slides that I sent to some of our co-organizers, and just wanted to see if that could be started. Thank you. So as was introduced just now, I am the executive councilman. I've been that for about 3 terms now, and it's been a really amazing learning experience to work within my community in that capacity. There is, over the last 3 terms, 2.5 terms now, climate change has become an increasingly important part of our discussions about community management of our resources, management of our limited but very critical funding to guide and direct what we think is important at that time, and into the future. Hopefully we become more and more familiar with what that is, and I'll discuss more of that today. So Malolap Atoll is located in the middle portion of the Marshall Islands. Nuclear testing, as referenced in my title page here, was conducted in the northern atolls, and some of my relatives, elders, specifically, my grandfather came from one of those, and so it's an issue it's close to home, if so to speak. And I guess we all wear different hats, but today I'll be kind of speaking from the Malolap context with the reference to my fellow Marshallese in the north part of the country. So future climate displacement is being projected as impacting atoll communities specifically. And there is a history of displacement. And if I can ask everyone to kind of notice the slide here is, maybe go back one more slide, is an image of both, I guess, the past causes of displacement with the nuclear testing. This is a particularly famous image from Bikini Atoll. I think this is the Able or Baker shot, one of the very first two. You can see the ships in the foreground of the mushroom cloud. So there was a lot of ships in the water at that time. So these were some of the first detonations, 57 in total, 67 in total, sorry, that occurred during the 1940s and up to the 50s. So that's the past, and there was definitely communities displaced then. And you'll also notice in the photo kind of this rising ocean with the trees. And this is another kind of iconic photo that maybe many of you have seen. This is on Kili. This is on Edgich Island, where Bikinians were displaced too. So this photo was taken by my friend Alson Kalen. He runs a canoe building project over here in Madro, and he lives on this island of Edgich, where the Bikinian people, amongst other places in the Marshalls and even in the US, have relocated to, and they're now living on Edgich. And this was a flooding that took place in 2014. So this is one of those iconic photos. So these two photos on top of each other kind of hopefully really ground our discussion from the Marshallese side as to what displacement is, both future and past experiences. Next slide, please. I know I have a very limited time, so I'm kind of gonna maybe just go through the next 3 slides quickly, but I think we all kind of get the main question here is, what did we learn from the past? I mean, that's basically where I'm starting the conversation about climate displacement, is learning from our past, and what did the displacement experiences in the past teach us? What did we learn? What did we learn from climate, from nuclear displacement that is applicable as we now face the very, as the previous speaker mentioned, just really gut-wrenching, identity questioning type of phenomenon that is climate change. You know, it really hits home in so many ways. So lessons learned from the past definitely need to be part of our toolkit for the future. Next slide, please. So one of the lessons I would suggest is that, and maybe click one more time there, that choice really makes a difference. When in past experiences, the people of Bikini were, I've done some research into this, and it's really amazing how over the course of 10, 15, 20, 30 years even, the question of where they were going to be relocated to always seemed to be a discussion outside of their area of influence. They were consulted, but they didn't participate in any meaningful way. I've spoken with my own father, who was a trust territory liaison officer at the time, had come here as an American Peace Corps volunteer, married my mother, and so I've spoken with him in his role in that process of selecting a relocation site. And it's just amazing how, you know, stories of people on airplanes flying to Palm Atoll. And I asked him, were there any Marshallese on the flight? None. Just amazing things like that, you know, really tell us how little choice was embedded into the process. Even though they say so, there's a lot of, you know, suggestions and measures that yes, there was participation, but when you really start looking at the historical records, choice was taken out of the equation frequently in the process of relocating the Bikinian people. So that's you know, choice makes a difference. Now, if I were to look at climate change and start to look at where we can embed choice into the process of planning investments, you know, we got to choose our indicators very, very carefully. We got to invest in the skills and tools and choose the people that receive to monitor and manage those indicators. We need to speak in the identifiable by a lot of the, you know, the experts that are out there, and just speak their language to a certain degree. So the lower right-hand side, you know, the IIM manual that is often used in asset management around the world, that this is one particular performance measure that is used. And I'll just ask the person who's clicking on the slides to just advance us to our last one and show that this is possible. These kinds of, you know, expertise, just keep clicking until the final, yeah. These kinds of expert-oriented measurements and tools and management and monitoring frameworks. Totally, Dr. Davis, who was at the University of Arkansas, she created a lot of this, but based on data that was supplied to her by myself when I was getting my my own research efforts, allowed participation, allowed choice. So I'll just end by saying that my home is that one that you see in the center of the image. It's kind of grainy and pixelated possibly, but the word by 2030, there's a green box and it says my home. So that's the home I grew up in. This is the community I come from, and I want to engage, and I think a lot of people can do the same thing in the process of determining displacement plans, tools, that way. So thank you, everyone. Hopefully some of the Q&A afterward will allow more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Again, a very insightful and informative messages that's coming across from your presentation this afternoon, and it's good to see that the common message and the common theme coming out is again on the need to have a community first approach. Sort of addressing this and ensuring that there is intentionality behind engaging with communities so that you can address the issue of internal displacement moving forward. And it's very encouraging to see the work, the foresight in your presentation in the context of your work in the Marshall Islands. And to give the perspective of the church and faith-based organization. I have the pleasure of introducing the Miss Frances Namomo from the Pacific Conference of Churches to add the perspective of the faith-based organization in addressing the issue of internal displacement. And I'm sure it's going to complement the perspective that's been shared already. Frances, over to you.
Vinaka Nava. Okay, everyone. Again, my name is Frances. I work as Ecological Stewardship and Climate Justice Program Coordinator for the Pacific Conference of Churches. To begin my presentation today, I wanted to take us back 11 years ago when the 30-member churches of the Pacific Conference of Churches agreed to the Moana Declaration. This declaration had recognized worst-case scenarios of people relocating or being displaced due to climate change, and the role the church will play in responding to this. We were fortunate in 2011 that the Fiji government invited PCC to be part of the relocation project of Wunindongoloa, the first relocated community in Fiji. And in 2014, while the to the new site 6 years later, we're still learning post-relocation work of what has taken place in Wunindongoloa, and of course the role that we know the church will need to buff up on in responding to this very sensitive issue. As part of my presentation, I'd like to share two stories, two insights from a couple in Wunindongoloa on how they had experienced the relocation process. The title of the two different stories is My Mets, Where Have They Taken My Mets? The old site. I've made up their names, but this has been given to us under consent from the couple who wishes to share their stories also with us and with those that will engage with us. My name is C. I'm 84 years of age, and this is my wife, Sarah. We spent most of our lifetime at the old village, where now only our loved ones rest and guarding the site. We did not agree to move here. However, we were never left out in the meetings and discussions of the relocation. It was indeed painful on the day we had to move. We were to move on the day that we had to move to the new site, we had a church service. All the small items that we could carry were loaded in the truck. I made sure my wife boarded the truck with other women and children. I chose to walk up. I wanted to feel for the last time the ground that I once ran around on. I have come to terms with what was happening and accepted that we were moving. I turned back every step of the way, hid my emotions, but continued to walk forward as I am making this choice not only for myself, but for my wife, children, and the future of my grandchildren. Maybe we were just doing what everyone else are doing. On the new site, this story was related to us by Thomas's wife. We got to the new site. They have already assigned families to their new homes. I looked around, it was beautiful, but I was not sure where we were going. Everyone had got into their homes, excited and a little bit sad at the same time. But I was left standing on the road near the truck, wondering which house have they chosen for me and my husband. A daughter of mine came to my aid and showed me the house they have selected for us. Oh, it's on the hill. Did they ever consider that we are now old and might find it difficult to move around? Anyways, I brought my daughter up to the house and I noticed they have not brought in all my belongings. Nonguimbe, Sakowivin Nonguimbe, translated, my mats, where have they taken my mats? I need those mats to spread in this house as this is our new home now. The strengths of our Mets. From an old village full of life memories and loved ones laid to guard their last foundation that can withstand the rising seas, to a new village of now dreams, maybe more opportunities and hope for the present and future. This culture of identity associated with Waitui and Wasawasa that was once part of the Wunidongolo community will now have to switch or adapt to farming on surrounding hills, breeding introduced fish species in their ponds, and grazing livestock as part of the relocation plan. The Met for us is a symbol of interconnectedness. While most of our Mets have withstand the test of times, broken, torn, repaired with new strengths, this also depicts the natural fabrication of our community, its connectedness to our vanua, to our ocean. Therefore, our relocation work, discussion, plans must recognize this when we're responding to climate-induced displacement or planned relocation. How central it is to engage or to understand the context from the vanua. There were issues regarding land and our projection that in the future this might create conflicts. How do we then build on the relationship that we already have through our traditional structures, clans and tribes in terms of ownership of land? Can we explore the indigenous or the Veiwekanis of Taubus, Naitas and Matangalis in Fiji in order to access land? The uniqueness of Met, this Met and its use in the Pacific. This portrays the vast ocean of learning in our region. Therefore, to assume the context in Fiji is similar to all other Pacific Island countries would be wrong. The use, shape, design of Mets all propose different messages and reaction to the issue at hand, especially when it's sensitive, like relocating. It is more than just directly responding to climate change impacts, but it's taking into account cultural and traditional aspects, indigenous spirituality, and the belief system that has shaped identity to the community that once lived on the old site. The Met is also spread to invite people for Talanoa. When the Met is woven and spread in the homes, it is open for everyone. All are invited to sit together on the Met and dialogue or Talanoa. This invitation to consultation allows participatory of the different groups, but must always be driven or centered around what the community wants. There is a projection. When we're projecting conflicts due to land issues for future relocation, shall we invite the aspects of peace building and conflict resolution in some of our processes in relocation or climate displacement? To conclude, our Met also projects resiliency. The Pacific Theological College, University of the South Pacific, and the Pacific Conference of Churches started 2 years ago a project called the Reweaving the Ecological Met. The project recognizes or promotes indigenous knowledge, spirituality, culture, and tradition, but also our faith, our different communities of faith, and how that can inform national and regional policies surrounding development frameworks or relocation process and displacements that often hits or are sensitive to communities that we respond to. Yes, so that's briefly the work that we have done this past year. Vinaka.
Vinaka Francis, and thank you again for highlighting the challenges of issues, the challenges and issues faced by community when they move into new site or new homes, and the complexity therein. And to unpack that complexity for us is quite useful as well, because conversation internal displacement differs from region to region, and other previous speakers, including you, have been really highlighting that conversation around internal displacement in the Pacific. It's speaking to people first. It's really understanding the needs of people. It's also speaking about land. It's about identity, and it's about the belief system as well. So thank you for bringing that across to help us understand again the complexity of internal displacement. Adding on to the sort of train of thoughts on identity and the significance of recognizing traditional knowledge. I have the honor of introducing our last speaker for today, Lucille. Lucille Apis Overhoff from the island of Pinglap. So Lucille will share a bit of reflection and her story, and she will also end with a poem. Lucille, over to you. Lucille, you're still muted.
Sorry.
Yeah, floor is yours now.
Okay, thank you. Before I start, my respects to all of you on this Zoom meeting. It's my pleasure to be with you today to share and learn from you. So I'll just, as was said, I'm just not representing the government. I'm just representing myself as the islander and my experience living in the islands. So while I was living out there for about 6 months in Yap, outer islands of Yap and in Bombay, I found that people living in the low-lying remote islands of Erosion, especially from those areas, you know, it's very different when you read about it and watch it on films, but to be actually there, you see, you hear, you feel, and are affected by what they are experiencing, because you experience those same things. Climate change is disrupting the daily rhythm of life in the islands. It is taking longer to find food. People are cooking green bananas even before they are ready. It's hard to find fruit, yellow ripe bananas, because they're cooked before they have a chance to ripen. And planting more food crops doesn't solve the problem, because plant growth is poor and the yield is less. Fish are smaller and further away from the lagoons. On top of this is increasing heat, king tides, and storm surges like expressed by many atoll people. When I asked the people there, why don't you just move or migrate to avoid all the problems? The answer is always similar. This is our home. How can we leave those who have gone ahead, already resting in the earth? Our culture and identity are tied to the island. And you know, I get it. There is a symbiotic relationship between island and people. That is, they depend on one another. While we are alive, the land nourishes us. When we die, our bodies nourish the land. People say, if we move, how can we pass our knowledge and skills to the next generation? The life on the land and in the sea differ on low islands and on high islands. On the low islands, our knowledge and skills are tied to the land and the sea. For instance, you plant a tree over an umbilical cord or with the afterbirth and of a baby. So we know the histories of the trees, such as breadfruit and chestnut trees that provide nourishment and life. And they also link us from one generation to another. Bodies perish and disintegrate, but the spirit continues in the trees and the land. Despite these threats to food, water, and health, and the possible demise of the atolls themselves, people are not rushing to leave the islands. They are not even exhibiting visible signs of distress, depression, fear, or anxiety, even if they have them. They remain happy and live each day as if it is a fresh new start. And every morning is just a brand new one, brand new life. So for most of these islanders, sustainability is living on atolls forever. People do travel internally or overseas, but it is always for employment, education, or health reasons. After all, it's a personal choice, because to separate people from their home is like separating a child from his parents or separating spouses. So in terms of resilience on the islands, the people, they adapt to the challenges thrown their way. Their traditional knowledge and skills evolve through adapting and being resilient. For instance, with regards to food security, the people, especially in the outer islands, they have what we call pit breadfruit or mar. Mar is a fermented breadfruit. And in the olden days, or not so old and recent, not too long ago, we used to line the pits with leaves, banana leaves, breadfruit leaves, all kinds of leaves. So it was natural lining, and then you put your breadfruit inside, cover it, and every season you add it, and when you have functions, you take them out. Unfortunately, because of saltwater intrusion, the saltwater rots the breadfruit, which can last up to 50 years. So you can eat the fermented breadfruit, which is like a dough. You just wash it and cook it any which way you want. So now people are using plastic lining. So instead of lining the pits with leaves, they line it with plastic. So yeah, they're quite resilient in that way. While I was out there, I didn't know how to quantify or measure, these intangible things such as emotions like fear, worries, and depression, and all that. So I talked with people, and based on their body language and their stories, I sensed how they were feeling. So, and coupled with how I was feeling, I developed some poetry after I got back. And I shared one last week, I think. Today I will share with you one which is entitled Global Warming. So I'm gonna end my short presentation with this poem. So it's called Global Warming. Many generations have come and gone, but thirsty, hungry, and fearful were none, till mighty global warming came. So much havoc it brought, it got fame. Those who created you should live in shame. For if fear, tears, and heartache was their aim, congratulations, deadly was their aim. Our food, our land, our culture, are our identity. Why do you seek to take away our identity? Stop your polluting so we can help global warming. No one is safe from global warming, not even polluters in your high-tech homes. For global warming knows not what homes are. Our food, our land, and our culture are our identity. Why do you seek to take away our identity? We are small, we are fragile, and we are family. Why do you destroy my family? Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Lucille, and for for that inspiring message at the end, and just got to show how connected are we to the places that we identify with, or that shape and forms our identity as Pacific Islanders. And thank you so much for also highlighting how the importance of sustainability and the way you're framing it, of living in the atoll forever, which is which really points to the fact about how close we are, and for giving us some sort of thinking around traditional knowledge as a way forward to sort of address this issue, from that food security story that you share about the fermented breadfruit, Omar. So thank you for that. We will now open the floor for discussion. Noting that we are back in time again on time is catching up with us, sorry. So there's a question, I'll start with a question that is on the, that's coming up on the chat group for now. Thank you so much for throwing that up. So I guess the first question is, so it's directed to any of the presenters. I wonder what messages the presenters have for non-economic aspects of relocation, migration, and loss experience in the region, informal DRR and climate assessments. So does any of the presenter want to respond to that? Or anyone in the chat group as well? Please feel free to pitch in with your contribution. But yeah, Francis, perhaps I'll start with you.
Thank you, Nazla. Thank you for that question, Alvin. I think at this stage, for non-economic loss and damages in relation to climate change or relocation and migration, through the Reweaving the Ecological Mat, there's also a publication called titled Ecological Accounting. This has actually allowed us, or is now open, at least for our member churches, the Theological College, USP Center, and PCC, to, I think, to go deeper into that conversation around non-economic loss and damage that often we cannot put a price tag to it. And it can be really difficult to express this in a space where, often you need to come up with a value in order to respond to these situations. So yeah, we've just published the Ecological Accounting booklet. It is something that we hope to use in the future to at least help our communities prepare to know the values of what they have, in their environment, surrounding environment. But at the same time, I hope that it might be able to provide something around other aspects that we really at this stage can value to Pinaka.
Wow, that's very, very, very useful to note.
And I think, Francis, you mentioned the book. Would it also be possible, if you're able to share it with the participants for today's webinar? It would be really useful. Thank you. And just looking at the time and being mindful that we are a bit behind, we'll just go on to the next question. It's a question for you, Francis. Where can they access the two documents with regards to your work in Vunindongoloa, and would you be able to share it as well in the chat for for the participants to view.
Yes. Thank you, Alice. We'll make that available to the participants.
Vinaka Francis. And just going on to the next question from Bruce. Thank you, everyone. Very rich and informative presentation. Question to Tammy. Do you have work you can share on how we can begin to shape an understanding of mobility and resilience, which is grounded in the culture and experience of the Pacific? And this raises important questions about indicators and measurement processes that Mark touched on as well.
Thanks, Alisi. I'm currently working on something that sort of explores mobility and resilience, but specifically focusing on the Go-Between people. But perhaps that could be used to also relate to other Pacific Island countries that might be displaced or might be relocated in the future as well. So it's not finished yet, but once it's finished, I'll ensure that it's circulated publicly as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. Mark, do you have any response from your end to the question raised by Bruce?
Yeah, thank you. I guess, you know, in terms of just this idea, and I'll try to merge it with the question from Sasai. You know, when we have the opportunity to talk to the people, like just attending the sermon that I mentioned in the chat room, you know, I was in the community, listened to this gentleman, Katuluman, preach, and afterwards I went and I talked to him afterwards. I said, hey, you know, that was amazing. You know, where did you get all this? And he said, it's just something I thought about. And so I obviously had to write it all down, and that's why I was able to post it very quickly there. But I've been thinking about a lot what he said, and I've come across other aspects of very similar, and I'll just, you know, Katilman's attitude in coping with sea level rise is very similar to the nature-based experiments that are being done by MIT people. You know, the idea that by making climate change vulnerability assessments so expert-driven, I think we wind up taking the people out of the process. The choices that they can make are part of the science. They're part of just the indicators themselves, the designing of those indicators and identifying what matters. By assuming that they don't know and they couldn't know, just that's a clear example to address Sasai's question, you know, how people's choices are taken out of the process. It starts very early and it continues through the process of planning, understanding the risks, measuring those risks, managing those risks. It's all part of what people need to be part of, their choices throughout that process. So thank you.
Thank you to the panelists for answering the questions. We've gone through the questions in the chat group, but is there anybody available who would want to share your experience in terms of internal displacement in your own country, or looking at the organizations that you work for? What interventions have you made with regards to this? So it's not only limited to the panelists, we also encourage stories from participants. Thank you.
Hi, just Anna from ADRA and Christine. We just wanted to share a recent experience in for Fiji, conducting a response in Lau, Kandavu, and Vatulele, would it be considered by definition that those who have been severely affected by COVID-19 and have returned to the islands, that they're also internally displaced? If they had a choice, they would still stay like in the Western Division throughout their entire life.
Sorry, can I just intervene on that question? Is that a question or a comment?
Sorry, Tammy, I didn't get.
Sorry, so Anna from ADRA posed a question. So I was just wondering if it's a question or a comment. It does sound like a question, and I just thought like maybe I can just add
A question, Tammy.
All right. So that's a very good question, because when we talk about internal displacement, I think it's one of the questions that I pose is really understanding what makes people feel displaced. So it doesn't necessarily have to be climate change impacts or related disasters, but what actually displaces them from their normal daily livelihoods. If I can say that, or displaces them from their normal residential place. And I think it's a good question to also think about while we're talking about internal displacement, because I think people that have been moving from urban areas back to the communities may be considered internally displaced, but also they might be causing some form of displacements as well in the community. So that perhaps require research and in-depth study to better understand these processes as well as the implications. Thank you.
Can I thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Add a little bit on the internal displacement. Now I'm putting on my government hat from FSM. While we were colonized is not the right word. It's politically incorrect now, but while we were under the German administration before the World War, what happened, there was a big cyclone and it damaged one of the outer islands of Chuuk. So what the Germans did, they brought the people on that island and they brought them to Pohnpei, to this island we call Sokes, which is part of Pohnpei. And these people, of course, they speak a different language. They have a different culture and customs. They have different traditional knowledge and skills. So when they moved here, you know, the local culture, tradition on Pohnpei, you don't cut the forest, the upland forest. You don't, you know, you leave the forest alone, the upland forest. But, you know, because they're not aware of the taboos, traditional taboos on this island, they cut down the forest and they build on the, you know, hills. And of course, after heavy rain, there was a landslide. So there's been situations in which a whole family, from grandfather to sons to grandchildren, were wiped out because of this, you know, it's just that they didn't follow, maybe not follow, but they were not aware that there's a taboo of the upland forest. So there's that again, you know, because you have your own traditional knowledge and wisdom and you come to another area and you're not aware of the customs and culture in that area. So, you know, you're not being bad or anything like that. It's just that you're not aware. So you cut down the forest because you want to build a house. And as a result, when there's heavy rain, it's just, so it's maybe 3 or 4 times in the last, maybe in the last 4 decades or so. Recently, last year, I think, and one body hasn't been found. So these are the sort of things that it takes many generations for the people to, what's the word, acclimatize and learn the culture on the new island. So maybe this is some of the things that we need to understand if we plan to, well, relocate people, if it comes to that. And maybe it won't happen in other islands and countries, because maybe it's totally different, but in Fort Bombay, it's happened quite a lot of times, just because there's a different culture and customs and ways of, the knowledge and skills are also different geographies as well, landscapes.
Thank you, Lucille and Tammy. Nada, would you like to make a comment?
No, just to say that the time factor, when we are trying to respond to that question, I think it's really questioning. So if people actually have been displaced and have been living there for 7 years, do we still regard them as internally displaced? So, and I like the perspective shared by Dr. Tammy about, you know, it's we've got to take into account the perspective of different individuals, those being displaced, as well as us looking in to those being displaced. So that is a very interesting question. But I guess, Alicia, we'll move on to the last question, and perhaps we can direct the last question, which is on the urban phenomena of internal displacement, and perhaps Mark can come into this. The question is from Daniel Fitzpatrick on. So I think his question is in three sections. So one is where areas subject to relocation pressure experience increasing numbers of people migrating to informal settlements in the city, and if that is the case, what is the perspective on this type of migration as an adaptive response to climate change pressures? And what are the good and bad aspects of climate migration to informal urban settlements? Yeah, so over to you, Mark.
Thank you. I think I understand the question, and I'll try to answer it. Internal displacement from rural to urban communities. And the perspective on this type of, you know, migration as an adaptive response. What are the good and bad aspects to informal urban settlements? I think in many informal urban settlements, there's a finite amount of land, habitable spaces, and, you know, being able to just as if, you know, those spaces still can be measured and monitored in terms of habitability or the suitability. I think this kind of discussion takes place often with flood modeling. I've discussed it earlier in the slide. You know, there's a threshold of tolerable flooding and risk that city planners and people who are, you know, whether you're a council member representing a rural atoll or a council member representing an urban atoll, you still need to have in place the types of measures and management tools that allow you to help the people. And you know, there's a lot of things that cannot be managed and cannot be measured, and I think that is often an excuse for not investing in the islands. People often say there's a lack of data, there's a lack of quality data in this context, and so we're just going to make some very qualitative assessments as to what is appropriate. And I think that the reluctance to invest in the data is what perpetuates that lack of data. And you know, it's something that maybe is out of this question's scope. So I'll try to come back to that scope, but just wanted to point that out, that, you know, whether you're in a city or in a village, you still have to have the same type of mindset to manage or to help people with their resettlement efforts, you know, whether it's forced or voluntary, and you know, designating spaces, creating spaces for settlement that is safe and fulfilling from a human rights perspective. All that, you know, would be very ideal, whether you're in a city or a rural environment. And I think what you wind up doing when you create this framework on essentially what it is city planning and, you know, good information, good data-driven decision making. What you essentially wind up doing is I think, reduce the pressures that cause urbanization to begin with. People start to realize, oh, there's actually there's better spaces in the rural environments than there are in the, you know, people's cities. And they start making better choices, you know, that are voluntary. So I think what we're generally, you know, is inhibiting the discussion at the moment is just there just seems to be a data shortage and a framework for decision making that really captures the opportunities for reducing the intangibles but improving on the tangibles at the same time, you know. And that's oftentimes, you know, those are the lessons that I would say are applicable from before and applicable today and will always be applicable better off. So thank you. I hope that answered the question.
Yes, yes, you did. But I'm sure a lot of people also would like to contribute into that that conversation around the how this issue of internal displacement is also rightfully increasingly being urbanized, and that is a conversation that we can definitely have offline moving forward, and hopefully we can address it as well in our next webinar series. I guess we can take this last question from Iwan Alisi. And the question is open to the panel to wrap this sort of Talanoa conversation up. And Iwan is asking if you can explain the particular measures and tools that are used to speak with potential host communities to assist with a community that is being relocated. And are there any lessons and experiences that has refined approaches to assist internally displaced communities or individuals? So perhaps Dr. Temi, I'll start with you, and then Lucille, you can come in as well. Thank you.
That's a very good question. And I think often when we talk about migration adaptation measures, we often forget the host communities. So in the case of the Gilbertese in the Solomon Islands, there wasn't any established conversation or consent that was obtained from the local Solomon Islanders. So a lot of the decisions that were made about the relocation was made between the administrations. And so the people of the Solomon Islands were not aware that they are receiving a large population of Gilbertese. And so there were a lot of problems, especially in terms of the integration of the community into a largely Melanesian society. I think one of the important things when we talk about relocation or when we're planning and developing different processes to assist with relocation, especially from the country of origin, a place of origin, to the host country, I think it's really important to also engage the local communities in the host country and not only the leaders, because eventually it's the local people that have to deal with the new migrants. And in the case of the Gilbertese, there were a lot of problems in terms of marginalization, and it created an enclave Gilbertese community rather than an integrated one, until a few decades later when they realized that. And so that's when the local community started opening up and trying to understand what was the purpose of the Gilbertese being in the Solomon Islands. So it takes several decades to reach that, but still they're slowly being integrated. But I think it is important not to forget the host community, not only the leaders, but also the local people. Thank you.
Thank you, Temi. Yeah, Lucille or even Francis, if you want to come in and if you have any response to that question.
Well, yes, I totally agree with Dr. Tabe. You know, you have to consider the host communities, especially since they will be living side by side with, I don't know, what we call it, migrant community. So yeah, it's very important so that they can get along with each other. Here, it's all about sharing. You know, there's a lot of feasting, and because we don't call meeting, we call it a feast. A meeting is a feast. So there's a lot of that going on. There's a lot of kava drinking. That's how we negotiate and talk, is over kava. So yes, I think it's not just the leaders, but the community members as well. Not just the government people, but the traditional leadership as well. So that they can integrate, so that they can adjust to each other and be able to live peacefully and with each other.
I would like to just add that I think a lot of the measures and tools are still being developed, and I think it's a very difficult thing to try to do in a sensitive way. There's a lot of pain and loss and grief involved in the process of the displacement, and so there's I think the measures and the tools, as much as possible, that are developed, if they're developed in a way that is again enhancing choices, I think some of those very difficult aspects of the process will be managed better. There will still be, however, still a lot of grief, and I think visual tools, maps, I've kind of started looking at more and more. The greater they are at replicating reality, they start to move into this realm of maybe playing an archival function, so that the loss is at least, kind of taking a snapshot of your memories before you have to leave, taking as much as possible. And so some of these maps are also helping in the grieving process before and after, I hope.
Yes, I echo what other panelists have stated. I guess in the Fijian context, our relocation have actually been, within the community's land. One of the clans own the land owned by a clan or tribe. We haven't had yet a case where we're receiving a community or so I think that's where I was posing in my presentation, the relationship that we already have here in Fiji. When we move to a new place, there's always the identifying yourself as an Aita, Tauvus. Yeah? How do we use this traditional relationship to build the communities before the process of relocation does take place? But it has to go back centered around the communities and not leaders or just governments or other stakeholders participating in that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis, for highlighting that. We have, I know there's still a lot of stories that people want to share, but unfortunately, time is not on our side. It has caught up on us. And but as we mentioned, this is a series of webinars that we will be conducting, and we welcome your participation in the future webinars, basically just to raise issue and create a Talanoa platform of the experiences that we have with regards to addressing internal displacement in our own context. So just to end things up, a big Vinaka Vakalevu from our end, and on behalf of the co-chairs IOM and GIZ, thank you for your participation in this webinar. It has been extremely valuable for us to be able to hear first-hand stories of what is happening, as well as learning some important lessons in addressing internal displacements. So just before closing, now I would like to hand over to Sabira for some points on the next steps with regards to our future webinar series.
Thank you very much, Lisi, and thank you again to all the presenters. I think we're just reflecting in the room how much we've learned, I think, from today. Just as next step, so as you mentioned already, Lisi, this is a series of webinar discussions. So we would really appreciate if anyone who has joined us today to come forward and let us know if you are interested in also sharing your story, because this is something that, you know, it's a discussion that needs to continue to be had. And then just also to maybe flag that the reason why we wanted to start doing this discussion was really also to feed into some of this high-level, global level work that is actually ongoing, particularly the high-level panel on internal displacement that has been established by the UN Secretary General. So the idea was that we would have Pacific regional consultation sometime in February. So that's one of the key next steps for us in order to sort of compile all of these, I guess, main outcomes and to feed into that. And also just, of course, to mention the Pacific Resilience Meeting in 2021, which Tia can give more background to. And also the other regional initiatives such as the Asia Pacific Ministerial Conference on TRI. So that's back to you, Alisi. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sabira, for the next steps. Tia, would you like to share something, or before we close the webinar for today?
Thank you, Alisi, and just to build on from what Sabira has said, part of this process, this is the webinar, what is one part of the process where we can actually highlight and have people share their stories, experiences, their work on this particular area. But also we're doing a survey, and we've been sending out the survey link as part of also building that story to inform any global and regional dialogue on this particular aspect of the resilience, but particularly on human mobility. So we would really encourage that those that we have shared the survey link to, that they do fill out the survey, and I'll just be putting up the questions. If you can put up the slide, just to sort of share what how the questions are being formulated, and the sort of the breakdown of those questions, if everyone can see the screen. So it's around the key issues and challenges, the political will, prevention, and local practices. And I think that was what was also coming out strongly from this current webinar, that, you know, how we put some of those qualitative data to be able to inform the conversation on internal displacement, and in the process, initiate actions that are relevant to the issue and relevant to the communities that are being impacted. So initially the survey, we closed the date for the survey, but we will be sharing the recording of this webinar. And so far the responses we've got have been from government, from civil society, academia, and also some of the regional agencies. And we would encourage more responses so that we can really have a sort of an informed collation of data or input into this issue across the country. That's sort of a bit of a snapshot of the responses we've got so far. We will reopen the survey and we'll be sharing it when we share a copy of the recording for this webinar. Thank you very much. And over to you, Alice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tia, for that. So with this, we would like to thank you so much for your time in attending this event, and especially a big binakavakalevu to the panelists for sharing your stories. So before we leave, a kind reminder, please take just a few minutes to respond to the survey as highlighted by Tia. And we look forward to you joining our next webinar in January. And of course, we will share the details for the call in advance. And should you be interested to share stories, please get in touch with Tia or Sabira. And we look forward to staying in touch and seeing you at our next discussion in January. So a big vinakavakalevu from our end. Thank you so much.